of Acts.
Morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you. My name is Edwin. I'm one of the pastors at One Life Church. And this morning we're going to be looking at a passage of scripture in Acts chapter 13 as we continue our series there. And this chapter is one of the few sermons recorded for us in the book of Acts, and it really is a history lesson. The thing with history is that it's much easier to look back at it than live through it. When you're living through it, it can be really difficult. But when you're looking back, suddenly it all makes sense. I visited the art studio of a really famous artist a while back, and her paintings are famous, you know, they are world renowned. When I went into her studio, I saw a piece that was not yet finished, and quite frankly, it looked like nothing. I couldn't really tell the difference between her palette and her painting. It just, I couldn't tell you what she was painting. Was it a person or was it a lion or was it a bird? It just looked like nothing. And yet, when it was finished, the next time I visited, it was this masterpiece. So I just couldn't see what she was seeing in the moment. But when I look back, it all made sense. And that's what this chapter does. That's what this sermon does as Paul relates history. And so Paul arrives in Pisidia, Antioch, in verse 13 with some of his companions, and they go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and the leader of the synagogue invites Paul to preach. Verse 16 says, "Standing up, Paul motioned with his hand and said, 'Men of Israel, and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me.'" And then he proceeds to tell them some of the history of Israel, covering a period of about 1800 years from the entrance into Egypt until the birth of Jesus. Verse 26, "Brothers, children of Abraham, and you God-fearing Gentiles, it is to us that this message of salvation has been sent. The people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus. Yet in condemning him, they fulfilled the words of the prophets that are read every Sabbath. Though they found no proper ground for death sentence, they asked Pilate to have him executed. And when they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead." And for about the next 10 verses, Paul reaffirms emphatically the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Verse 38, "Therefore, my brothers, I want you to know that through Jesus the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you, and that through him everyone who believes in him is freed from everything from which they could not be freed by the law of Moses." The first thing we see in this passage of scripture is that history is in the hands of God. And so Paul speaks about 1800 years. Paul speaks about a period covering 1800 years. He speaks about the patriarchs, their move into Egypt, slavery in Egypt, the deliverance from Egypt, the occupation of Canaan. He speaks about the period dealing with prophets and judges and kings. Speaks a lot about David and that period of history. And then he brings us right to the period of Jesus. And friends, what this sermon shows us is that history, these 1800 years, were never just a random passing of time, but it was a history in the hand of God. It was events and seasons and things taking place that were orchestrated by the sovereign hand of God. And it is only in looking back that you see his hand. And so in this chapter, there are phrases used like this: God said, God did, and God raised, and God removed, and God gave. And this little phrase that goes, "But God," this happened, but God, this happened, but God, this should have happened, but God. And these phrases show us that God is not just present, but God is sovereign. And God is in control. And though you don't see it in the time, when you look back, you see the purposes and you see the hand of God being fulfilled. And they all culminate and they are all leading to the most important event in the history of humanity: the birth and the death, the resurrection, and the work of Jesus. And so, friends, as we look at this sermon, we should find such courage for ourselves to be able to live very secure lives in insecure times. We should be able to live very certain through times that are uncertain, because we know who's writing the history. Now, friends, if you were able to parachute back in time to those 1800 years, if you could just pick a moment and go back in time and land in that moment, it would probably be a very difficult life that you would find. In fact, contrary, when you're able to look in retrospect to see the hand of God, if you could go back in time, you'd probably ask yourself this question: where is God in this? If you went back 1800 years, you would be a man 100 years old with the promise of children and nothing happening. If you went back 1500 years, you would be a worthless slave, being mistreated by the Egyptians. If you went back 1400 years, you'd be wandering through the desert, passing the dead bodies of your friends every time you went around. If you went back 1200 years, you would find yourself in a society without a leader, morally corrupt, depraved. If you went back 900 years, you would find yourself in a kingdom divided, constantly at war, constantly being defeated. If you went back 550 years, you'd be a slave again, this time in Babylon. If you went back 450 years, you would find yourself in Jerusalem, once the glory of the entire planet, now broken and burnt and lying in ruins. If you went back just 100 years, you'd be living in a time where God hadn't spoken for centuries. And so in the moment, in the living of history, often we don't see the hand of God. But knowing His sovereignty enables us to pass through these periods of time, knowing and finding security in His control. There is a beautiful verse in Isaiah chapter 50 that says this: who of you fears the Lord and obeys the word of His servant? Who walks in darkness and has no light, yet trusts in the name of the Lord and relies on Him? Who among you walks in darkness? Who among you has no light? In other words, who among you is going through a period of time where you just cannot see anything? You can't see back, you can't see forward. You're going through a period where it's like, where is? Your word says you are the light to my feet and a lamp unto my path. It's just pitch black. But who is the one who trusts in the name of the Lord and relies on Him? The next truth we see from this sermon, and it's by far the focus, the centrality, it's by far the bulk of this sermon, is the person of Jesus. His death, His burial, His resurrection, and what He accomplished. And so we read in verse 23 that God brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as He promised. We read in verse 28 that though they found in Jesus no guilt worthy of death, yet they asked Pilate to have Him killed. In verse 30 we read these words: but God raised Him from the dead. In verse 38 it talks about the fact that through Jesus the forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed, and there would be freedom for those who believe from those things from which we could never be freed by following the law. as Paul talks about this history, the center, the focus, the culmination, the crowning glory, the consummation of history is the person of Jesus. Now, friends, of all the truths in Christianity that I could be asked to preach on, the one I feel most unqualified, the subject, the truth that I feel I cannot begin to do justice to, is the person of Jesus. How do you preach the love and the life of Jesus? How do you do justice to his death, his resurrection, his humanity, and his divinity? How do you do justice to Jesus the Lion and Jesus the Lamb? I feel so completely inadequate to do justice to Jesus. And perhaps the best way I can do it is by looking at some of the responses of people to Jesus in the Bible. See, verse 25 in this chapter refers to John the Baptist. And that story is taken from John chapter 1. And just think of when John the Baptist began his ministry. It had been hundreds of years before a prophet had spoken. And yet every Jew within his heart would carry the anticipation of a Messiah. Even if that anticipation was worn thin, there was this hope in every Jew that a Messiah, a deliverer, somebody who would come and bring the government of God. And there was an anticipation of a kingdom coming that was so vastly different. In fact, it's described in Isaiah chapter 11 as the lion will lie down with the lamb, and the wolf will lie down with the goat. And it says little children would lead them, and the earth would be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God. Their anticipation was of a deliverer Messiah who would completely change the order of the world. A lion and a lamb being led by a child. And so with this anticipation of a Messiah, suddenly there is a voice. Suddenly there is a groundswell of anticipation, and people are going out into the desert to hear this voice, and everybody is wondering, could this be the Messiah? And the Pharisees and the religious leaders send people out into the desert, and they ask him, are you the one? And John's reply is, I am not the Christ. And they say to him, well then, are you Elijah? I'm not Elijah. Are you a prophet? I'm not a prophet. Then what are you? And he humbly says, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. He says, among you stands one you do not know, and he's coming after me. He says, I'm not worthy to bend down and untie the shoelaces of his sandals. That was his attitude of reverence and privilege in the person of Jesus. What of John's mother Elizabeth? Elizabeth and Mary, Luke chapter 1 tells us, were both pregnant. Mary was pregnant with little baby Jesus, and Elizabeth was pregnant with little baby John. And it says that Mary came to visit Elizabeth, and as she walked in the room with just little baby Jesus inside of her, the Holy Spirit moved Elizabeth, and little John gave a kick inside of him. And Elizabeth's response was, who am I that I should be visited by the mother of my Lord? That's a privileged appreciation of who Jesus is. Simeon, the Bible tells us in the book of Luke, was an old man living in Jerusalem. And his heart was looking for this deliverer. And he was longing for this deliverance. And it says that God had promised him, you will not die until you see the Messiah. And he was led by the Spirit one random day to visit the temple. And there he sees little 8-year-old baby Jesus being circumcised. It says that he took him in his hands and praised God and says, now, Lord, let your servant depart in peace as you have promised. For my eyes have seen the salvation that you have prepared in the sight for all nations, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles, and glory to your people Israel. Right? Here is this man who, just to be able to hold 8-year-old baby Jesus, says, Lord, you can take me now, my life is complete. Friends, as we look at these, and there are many other beautiful pictures of how people revered and honored Jesus. Not one of them had heard Jesus preach. Not one of them had seen a miracle. This was just little baby Jesus, but it was enough for them to revere and to honor him. And so we see in this wonderful sermon, first of all, God writing history. And secondly, we see in this wonderful sermon that when we understand God sovereign over the events of time, it puts in us a certainty. This is not just something moving along randomly, but it's under the control of God our Father. And then we see in this sermon how everything culminates in the person of Jesus and the incredible privilege that you and I have of knowing him and living free and living forgiven. And this amazing line, but God raised him from the dead. In closing, there are a couple of statements in this sermon that help us in our response to God. And the first is the fear of the Lord. Paul addresses this congregation, men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. I have never preached a sermon and addressed the congregation with, you who fear God, listen. That would be so unpopular in the 21st century. There is a beautiful verse in Acts chapter 9 and verse 31, which gives a different angle, a different take on what the fear of the Lord is. It says, now the church in Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace and was strengthened. Now that sounds like a good church to be a part of, a church enjoying peace and strength. It goes on to say, living in the fear of the Lord and the comfort of the Spirit. The fear of the Lord and the comfort of the Spirit, it increased in numbers. You cannot separate the fear of the Lord from the comfort of the Spirit. Friends, we should only hold one fear, one holy, legitimate, and reverent fear, which is the fear of God. And when we hold godly fear, we will have no other fear. Psalm 34, verse 4 says this, I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Which fears? The illegitimate ones, the ones that cripple, the ones that limit, the ones that paralyze. So God comes to deliver us from every fear except for one. A few verses later, it says in Psalm 34, fear the Lord, you holy people. Those who fear the Lord lack no good thing. We are called to fear just one person, one being, and that is God. And I encourage you to read Psalm 45, where it says, this poor man sought the Lord, and he heard him and delivered him from all his fears. And there is this picture in Psalm 45 of every ungodly fear God removes from us. And yet the very next verse says that those who fear him lack no good thing. In fact, I read this beautiful verse this morning. Proverbs chapter 28 verse 14 says this, blessed is the one who always trembles before God. And in this verse, we see we are encouraged to be those who live in the fear of God. Because when we live in the fear of God, we need fear nothing else. The second little phrase that we see in this chapter 13 is where it says that David served the purposes of God in his generation. Isn't that a beautiful truth for us? The purposes of God in your generation. Dear friend, you are on this planet for a brief moment. But in that brief moment, God has such purpose for you to live in. In your generation, God has some fruit that He would have you bear. He has some things that He would have you build. And that you and I would say, I have served the purposes of God that He had for me in my brief moment of being on this planet. Paul ends off his sermon with this phrase that is recorded, that he urged them to continue in the grace of God. Dear friends, grace is not automatic. Grace is a cloud, it's not a sky. In other words, you can live under it as a believer, but you can also move away from being under it as a believer. Grace, experientially, is not automatic. We can misread it. We can misconstrue it. We can abuse it. Colossians chapter 1 says of the believers in Colossia that they understood the grace of God in all its truth. In other words, you can misunderstand the grace of God. The wonderful picture we have in this sermon that focuses so much on Jesus is this grace of God that leads us to a transformed life. Friends, today is Father's Day. And in this chapter, Paul uses the lovely phrase he quotes from Psalm 2, I am your father. Today I have become your son. He speaks that, referring to the relationship of God the Father with Jesus. But I wonder how true that is for you. I wonder if you know that God is your Father and that you are His Son. If you have received Jesus, as this verse, as one of the verses says, those who believed in Him, if you have believed in Jesus, He is your Father, you are His Son. If you have never put your faith in Him, let today be that moment that you would know.